Okay, welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Michael Higgs, Program Manager here at Conscious Capitalism. On behalf of the CCI team, we appreciate you taking time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we're excited to be sharing space with Jocelyn Corbett of PolicyLink to discuss developing corporate standards to improve racial equity. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world working to change the practice and purpose of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership and engagement with our local chapters. Several times a month, CCI offers virtual gatherings like this as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Jocelyn will present information for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the final 10 to 15 minutes of our session. Please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties or have any questions or issues technical related, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org and we'll give you a hand. Now, I'm excited to introduce you to Jocelyn Corbett, Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink. Jocelyn is committed to advancing racial equity in the private sector. Trained as a cross-section leader through Coro's Fellowship in Public Affairs, she's worked across nonprofit, for-profit, and movement spaces in pursuit of economic equity. Prior to joining PolicyLink, Jocelyn managed the chapter network of certified B corporations across the United States and Canada, and led B Lab's first impact improvement initiative to advance equitable and inclusive business practices across North America. She's thrilled to marshal that experience into developing corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity, which have the power to change the way business is done. Jocelyn sits on the board of Food Culture Collective. She lives in Durango, Colorado, and travels to Oakland, California whenever she possibly can. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really quite a treat to be here. So thank you so much, all. I am Jocelyn Corbett, as Michael just shared, Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink. And PolicyLink is a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. And as Michael shared, I was previously at B Lab, which many of you know is the organization behind certified B corporations. And so hopefully you know that I have a lots of respect for conscious capitalism and the power of business to be a force for good. So I'm really, really excited to be here and speaking with you all today. I know you're here to learn, and I have a lot to share with you, but I want to start on a personal level. I'd love if you would take a moment to write down answers to a few questions. The first is reflecting on where you work, even if it's your own company. Why does this business, this organization, this school get my time and talent? So take a moment to just write down, why does this organization that I work for or have started get my time and talent? And the next question I invite you to consider, to write down, why do I care that business be a force for good? Today, my guess is you've answered that question before, but today, why do I care that business be a force for good? I'll share a few of my whys with you to start. I care that business is a force for good because business impacts every aspect of my life. It's my paycheck. It provides the goods and services that I need. Businesses pay not an insignificant portion of the taxes that fund my parks, schools, streets. that shapes the local infrastructure of where I live here in Durango. Business influences our culture at large, right? Through marketing and storytelling, determining what we care about, what we value, what we hold up, what we're talking about. And of course, business is shaping my future and my kids' future through its use or its protection of resources, not single-handedly, but significantly. And PolicyLink is the organization that gets my time and talent, because PolicyLink has been about racial equity for nearly 25 years. I'll share more about why racial equity matters to business in just a second, but I want to share why it matters to me personally. And that's because at the core, racial equity is about humanity. Valuing and respecting the humanity of all people, including me, including those that I love. All right, I want to jump in here to our discussion. So let me share my screen. Awesome. And today, I'll define what I mean by racial equity to start. I'll tell you about a partnership that you should know about, the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, that's dedicated to deepening the private sector's role in advancing equity. We'll discuss some of the pitfalls and opportunities that we've seen for business leaders who are engaging in this work. And I'll share what's on the horizon for businesses when it comes to racial equity, the corporate performance standards. And we'll leave some time for your questions, as Michael shared. So let's start with how we define equity. Equity is the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Pretty straightforward. And why racial equity specifically? Because in this country and around the world, race is a predictor of how well one fares across nearly every major life indicator: health, education, wealth, employment, pretty much you name it. And when we see significant correlation between race and life outcomes, we need to be curious about what's going on there. Specifically, we need to look at the systems that continue to deliver poorer outcomes for people of color and others who have had greater barriers to success historically and today. And I want to just name the Groundwater Institute. They have a base camp training, which is an incredibly powerful training for those who want to deepen your understanding and your historical underpinnings of race and racial equity in this nation and more broadly. That's a beautiful place to go. Unfortunately, we don't have time to unpack all of that in our conversation today, but I really uplift their work. So I want to include another core piece of information that guides our work. And that is that there are 100 million people who struggle to make ends meet in the United States, which is about 1 in 3 people in this country. Most of those are people of color, but this also includes white people. Racial and economic outcomes are interconnected in this nation, as in many parts of the world. And everything we do at PolicyLink, and our conversation today, the work I'll share with you, is to improve the lives of those 100 million people. So why do businesses need to be concerned with equity? For many of you in this virtual room who are committed to business as a vehicle to create value, prosperity, cooperation, you may not need me to go on. But all business leaders should be concerned with racial and economic equity, and I'll name 3 reasons: workforce, customer base, and a stable economy. So for workforce, the United States will be majority people of color by 2045, which represents a significant and rapidly growing talent pool, especially among young people. And when we think about our customers, my guess is that you've been paying attention to the Edelman Trust Barometer, especially over the last number of years. The employee base and the customer base expects CEOs to lead. 86% of people polled, this was a few years ago now, but this hasn't changed significantly, agree that CEOs must lead on societal issues. And you can see from the numbers here too, that the customer base expects businesses to take on a bigger role in societal impact. So let's not wait for government anymore. It's time for CEOs and business leaders to lead, to hold themselves accountable to the public. You can see these numbers here. And specifically in the United States, businesses should not only care about, but do more for racial equity and diversity. So you can see here that 95% of Black people in the nation that were polled believe that large companies have more to do. And 80% of all people that were polled chimed in. So our nation is rapidly becoming more diverse, especially the next generation. Customers and society at large are pressuring companies and expecting companies to take a bigger stand on societal issues and racial equity in particular. And the last point that I'll share is significant and not always easy to think about, but it refers to the stability of our economy at large. So if 100 million people are not making ends meet, economic inequality and racial inequity, because remember we talked about how deeply interconnected they are, creates rifts in our nation. Our country cannot function properly when the divide gets too great. Our economy isn't stable when our nation isn't stable. We've seen that with the Great Resignation. We've seen that over history as people have really been struggling. Our economy then is impacted and business as usual is not being carried out. And I'm not even sharing the slides here that I have about the revenue that's currently lost from high turnover, from the racial pay gap, underutilized talent. Suffice it to say, racial equity already is impacting the bottom line and will continue to do so if significant action isn't taken. But I want to come back, especially while this slide is up, I want to come back to the fact that you and I, the business leaders, are people at the end of the day, right? People who care about other people, who want to make a lasting and positive impact, especially in this group, especially with the Conscious Capitalism Network, who want to be proud of a nation that takes care of all of its people. So that's another reason why this matters to business. We're people and we care. So given that backdrop of all of the reasons that businesses should be thinking about and caring about racial equity, I want to introduce the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance. 3 organizations created a partnership called the Alliance because there is huge opportunity here to support our economy, ensure businesses are thriving, and accelerate the path to racial equity through business. So let me introduce you. We've talked about PolicyLink. We've been focused on racial equity for the past 24 years as a think and action tank. FSG is a consulting firm, is another founding partner that supports leaders to create lasting social change. Just Capital polls the American public and then guides businesses and investors to align their strategies with the public's priorities. And together, we have a powerful mix of skill sets to help companies ensure their investments in equity actually translate into equitable outcomes for people. Our mission is to support the evolution of anti-racist, equitable corporations that can contribute effectively to building a just and healthy nation for all. The primary way we're doing that is by creating standards, which I'll share more about in a moment. And as I shared before, central to our work is the 100 million people who are struggling to make ends meet in this country. Before I share more about our standards work, I want to share about some of the background research that we've done that led us to developing the standards in the first place. We interviewed dozens of business leaders to better understand what was getting in their way when they were thinking about or actively participating in advancing equity in their companies. And I'd like to share a few of the themes, largely the pitfalls that we heard when folks were trying to advance equity, and then I'll offer some antidotes to those pitfalls. So the first one is maybe not unfamiliar, the fear of making mistakes, right? Which is so reasonable. Because again, this work is about our humanity. It really matters. We don't want to hurt people, nor do we want to be public in our mistakes and as we're learning potentially a new skill set. However, you'll notice there isn't often a fear of making mistakes in business in general, right? There's a lot of innovation and challenge and learning and disrupting and learning along the way. And so we argue that some of this fear of making mistakes, or rather the resiliency that supports business leaders in other areas of their work can be applied to this work as well. But I've still got some antidotes for you. Because again, this is human, right? Our fear of making mistakes is human. And the first is that you don't have to do this alone. Business leaders do not have to do equity work alone. Getting support through learning experiences like the Groundwater Institute that I mentioned, like Racial Equity Institute. There are so many organizations out there that are offering deep capacity building and transformational learning experiences for leaders and for companies beyond. And of course, there are consultants who are expert at making strategic plans for equity. So you don't have to do this alone. And then I also lift up engaging stakeholders thoughtfully at every step of the way. When you can be pressure testing and working with people to test your assumptions, to test your plans at every step. So for example, intentions, you share your intention with stakeholders, share drafts of your plans with stakeholders, drafts of goals. Getting feedback early and often can also help to make sure that there aren't big gaffes or mistakes that are very public that then need to be walked back. Not to mention, if this work is intended to benefit your frontline workforce, people of color, your low-wage workforce, then engaging them in the actual design of the work is really critical to doing this work with integrity. The next pitfall we see or we heard often is that companies are maybe doing this work, but afraid of scrutiny, and so they aren't being transparent about their goals or their work. And one of the challenges here is that this can really impact trust with major stakeholders, with employees, with consumers. If companies are not being clear about what they're doing or transparent with what they're learning or the progress that they're making. And so probably unsurprisingly, the antidote is to be more transparent, to be more open, and certainly to hold humility. Again, we're all people learning together. And so taking an approach of humility can be really helpful while being open and sharing the work that's being done, the goals, the lessons learned along the way. And then the final pitfall I'll highlight here is the lack of cohesive strategy. So for example, we may have a really inspired and eager marketing team that's actively diversifying images it uses or models, ads, et cetera, on the one hand. And simultaneously, the product team may not have incorporated enough diverse input into its design process. And so they're designing products or services that don't necessarily meet the full diverse audience that's being reflected in marketing, right? So this can happen because departments are moving forward at different times or not necessarily connected. But what this ultimately does is break trust with stakeholders and undermine the effort, right? If the right hand isn't talking to the left. So racial equity in this work is no different than any other business imperative, right? It requires a comprehensive strategy, and that strategy needs to start at the top. So that's the easy way to mitigate this is to not allow it to be siloed or department by department. And the good news is, as we shared before, there are experts more than ever now who can help businesses create that comprehensive approach. And it requires time and investment. I know a number of racial equity experts who are saying, we won't work with you unless you are committed to working with us for at least 1 year or 18 months or 2 years or 3 years, because this is a journey. It takes time to create a comprehensive strategy approach. So plan that in as you're beginning. And I'll share that there are free tools that one can use, including in the very near future, corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity. So let me share a little more about that here. So the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, PolicyLink, FSG, and Just Capital are developing corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity. And I want to return to the personal again, because this work is not separate from our humanity, from our personal work. Here are the 10 equity outcomes that the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance has defined for all institutions to have a responsibility to contribute towards. So all institutions, business, government, our public leaders, our nonprofits, et cetera, we believe all institutions have a responsibility to contribute to these 10 outcomes, including business. And I'd love for you to take a look here and see if you can see your why fitting into this list. I feel particularly inspired by a thriving multiracial democracy, especially in this deep moment of divide and polarization. I feel really inspired by the idea of balanced power. I feel really inspired by climate, environmental, and social justice. I imagine I'm not alone on this call. So these 10 outcomes guide our work, and our standards will map to these 10 outcomes. So what do these standards aim to do? They aim to clearly define what equitable corporate action looks like across all domains of impact. So that includes within a business's four walls, its relationship to the community and to society at large, thereby setting new norms for equity. Because right now, there isn't a central definition of what equity looks like in business. So you remember a couple of years ago with the murder of George Floyd, there were a number of statements, companies committing, we believe in Black Lives Matter, we are committed to racial equity, but there wasn't necessarily a benchmark or a framework that the public, that workers could know, oh, when you make a statement like this, when you say you commit to racial equity, what does that mean? What are you doing? And that's the gap that we aim to fill, to clearly define what it would look like for a business to be committed to racial equity across the enterprise. And then finally, the standards will advance the field by driving more data and disclosure. And we know it's hard to set goals for where we need to be unless we have a current understanding of where we are. And in general, data around the diversity of workforce and equity initiatives are not widely apparent and shared. And so we hope that this helps advance our full understanding of where we are in order to define where we need to get to. So returning to the pitfall we discussed earlier about a lack of comprehensive strategy, you can see that these standards cover the full gamut of corporate activity. So on the right is the 2021 CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. When I was sharing before, we did a bunch of research and talked to business leaders to understand where their biggest pain points and challenges were in advancing equity. We heard guidance, clarity around what does it mean? This feels opaque, this feels challenging. We need to understand more deeply, what does it mean to advance equity? What would that look like? And how do I go about it in a meaningful way? And so one of the first things the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance did was to publish this blueprint, which outlines all of the actions and the most significant actions to drive outcomes across this framework within the company, community, and society. So that's the work upon which our standards rest. And here on the left, you see a brief snapshot of what the standards will cover to give you a sense of the scope. So within the company, we'll have standards on governance and leadership, products and services, which is often left out of this work, on the supply chain, on HR, worker power and voice. Within the relationship between the company and the community at large, we'll have standards on corporate philanthropy, environmental impact. We'll think about policy at a local level. Trust and relationships is really big within the community. And then beyond that, considering a business's impact on society at large, that's where things like, how is a company impacting our democracy? How is a company's communications impacting what we value through marketing, et cetera, and their investments, be that through a number of different channels. So each standard will define the high bar for equity. So that's really important. Many standards that exist are disclosure standards. They're saying, disclose what your company does on X, Y, or Z as an accountability tool. We believe in disclosure as well. I think that's really important for us as a field to gain more information. But we also believe in defining what equity looks like. Again, being responsive directly to the business leaders who are asking, what do you mean exactly? What is the standard for equitable action? And so we will have performance goals associated with every standard that we put forward. And they're going to be a high bar, right? It doesn't make sense to kind of support equity. We want to define what equity actually looks like. And so we don't expect companies will reach that high bar right away. But that shouldn't deter companies from starting. And we've built in interim milestones along the way so that companies know, oh, how would I get to this high bar over time? And of course, guidance to support businesses as well. And we are currently in the process of developing these standards. We've spent the last 2 years on foundational research, deep public comment period, defining our approach and methodology, which we got incredible feedback to. And now we're deep in standards development. And I'll share that we're inviting feedback throughout our development process. These standards need to work for you, right? As business leaders, these are your standards. So we invite you to share your perspective through a pressure testing session or through a beta test of the subset of standards. And it's very important to note that there are a lot of stakeholders to whom these standards are important. And we have been deeply engaging stakeholders across different networks. So we've been engaging with workers, we've been engaging with people of color, we've been engaging with the underemployed and unemployed, people for whom the economy is not working, racial equity experts, investors, business leaders, academics. There's a huge cohort of people that we've been engaging. But I do want to underline, of course, that business leaders' input really matters. So this year we're developing the standards. Next year, we'll release the standards along with an assessment tool to guide one's progress and have an initial small pilot of companies that will be testing out the standards with us. So if you're excited about this, let us know. We want to engage with you. If you're skeptical about this work, let us know. That's valuable information as well, especially if we're fundamentally aligned that business can do good in this world and racial equity matters. We want your input around how to shape these standards to work for you. And I will then invite you through a couple of different mechanisms. So please reach out to me directly if you're excited about this effort or you're interested and you want to pressure test the standards. So that looks like join in our confidential conversation, small group session where we present here are the standards as we're developing them. What is standing out to you? What feedback do you have? It's a 1 hour conversation. And then if you're interested in piloting the standards, I have an email address here too. That will be either there's, beta test the standards, which is a shorter engagement, or do a full pilot of the standards in 2024, which would be an incredible learning opportunity. There will be people walking alongside you to help you think about how you're implementing this work at your company. So it would be a really cool opportunity to get involved in 2024, and now's the right time to be thinking about that. But we invite you to join us because we need you all in this effort. And Michael, with that, I am happy to turn it over to you and to see if there are questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. The slide you shared on the 10 equity outcomes, I was very inspired by health and well-being as one of the outcomes. Thank you for giving that very inspirational slide. For those that are wondering, we will have this as a recording and be made available. Jocelyn will also be providing the slide deck as well. Included in the email will be the contact information on those final slides. So if you want to engage and participate, that will be very, very easy for you to do in the outgoing email for anyone who's registered for the webinar. So thank you, Jocelyn. We do have a couple questions coming in. And for those, I did put this in chat, but if you do have any questions for Jocelyn, please add them to the Q&A queue on the bottom of your screen, and we will go ahead and take some of those questions. So, Jocelyn, first question for you is, how do you recommend corporations incorporate these standards into their ESG work?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So I'll speak to kind of how this fits into ESG work or DEI work more broadly, and then I can talk about the specifics of the standards. So, often within companies, we have somewhat siloed impact areas. So we're thinking about environmental social governance, we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we don't necessarily map these things together. So racial equity very clearly sits within, it sits across all of them, frankly, as you saw in the way that we define the outcomes. But specifically, as you're thinking about social impact, racial equity, and others refer to it maybe as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, fits very squarely within that social component. So sometimes we just have to connect the dots for the C-suite or senior leaders as we're thinking about these things. So these are not distinct. And frankly, you also probably saw across our domains, actually, we didn't totally get into this level of detail, but I will just speak to the fact that diversity and inclusion are absolutely included in what we do. We frame this as racial equity work because we are outcomes oriented. We really want to create equity. We want to improve outcomes. Diversity and inclusion are important for getting us there. And so we think about those and integrate those into the standards. But that's why we framed it within racial equity. And so this also fits in your DEI work as well. And to the first part of the question, how do we incorporate this work? At the moment, it's through participating with us in drafting and giving feedback to the standards since they're not yet live. And then the next big step would be in piloting the standards. But once we launch them in 2024, the hope is that this is a framework. It's a tool that someone can download and just say, here is an outline of the work that we can do with an outline of also where to start. Maybe you're working with your equity consultant and saying, let's drive towards these outcomes. And here's a bit of a roadmap.
Thank you. Next question is, what are you seeing as leading examples of companies, organizations, or communities addressing racial inequities at deep structural levels versus surface level symptoms or more typical internal DEI efforts?
That's a beautiful question, and I think it's coming from Tim. Tim, it sounds like you have a deep understanding of how this work works. So I will share that there is, there may be companies out there doing this perfectly. The companies that we come across often are not doing this perfectly across absolutely every area. They have room to grow. But we can point to some examples who are really have strong efforts in some areas. And these are probably examples that you may be familiar with. Ben & Jerry's comes to mind. They have a campaign to end qualified immunity. They've done a tremendous amount of advocacy work. So using their external platform to advocate for policies that impact racial equity. And then they've also done, for example, they've had pints, and I'm not remembering exactly what they look like, but ice cream pints that were in support of racial equity in some way or another. So that's influencing the cultural narrative, right? So that's the narrative piece. We've seen a number of financial institutions who understand that financial institutions have a history of exploiting people of color and trying to find opportunities to structurally impact the wealth and benefits people of color receive and low-income people receive, and target products and services for access. So we have an example of PayPal and the Worker Financial Wellness Initiative, which they're doing, I think, in partnership with Just Capital. So there are a couple of case studies, and I can share actually the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance.org website has a number of these case studies in greater detail. I want to lift up one final one, Rhino Foods, which is near and dear to my heart. They are a company that develops, I think what they call them inserts for ice cream, for Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And their business model is deeply connected to economic equity. They're often hiring people through second chance hiring models, et cetera. But I want to uplift their income advance program. So this is a opportunity for them to provide small dollar loans to their employees, many of whom don't have bank accounts, don't have access to those loans, and very low interest rates. And then the program actually also helps to build their savings. So there are a number of companies that are doing this work in deep ways, specifically in a couple of areas. But I appreciate, within your question is also the answer. There are a lot of folks who are either from a place of really good intentions and we need to get started, and so let's change the diversity of our workforce, are doing more surface level work, or from the place of like, what can we just do quickly because we're under scrutiny, let's check some boxes, right? There's that as well. And so our standards are really intending to continue to deepen the work towards some of that structural change that you highlighted. Thanks for that question, Tim.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for the thoughtful answer. The next question, it's actually a series of questions, and perhaps I'll try to capture the ethos, I think, Jocelyn. I would imagine that, as multinational corporations adopt the standards of performance goals for racial and economic equity, many of their operations may be in parts of the world that are affected by conflict, and there may be deep divides between rule of law, economic opportunities, rights and protections. Have you given any thought to how a multinational company could sort of adopt these performance standards to impact some of those citizens of countries that don't enjoy some of the same protections that we do?
Yeah, very thoughtful question and really important question. Because when we were talking at the beginning about how business impacts so many areas of our life, we know that's true across the world, right? So we are very clearly and pointedly focused on the United States to start, in part because we recognize that approaches to race and racial equity, all of the things that you identified below, have particular histories and particular ways that they show up, cultural meanings and significance and ways that they need to be addressed. We see the United States as a leading nation. I should be careful with that language. There has been a lot of attention placed, especially in the last number of years, especially in the corporate sector, around race and racial equity. And given the significant role the United States plays across the private sector and globally, we see this as a really powerful place to start here with humility. We see opportunities for multinationals to participate right now through components of their business units, et cetera, that are based in the United States. So if they have significant operations, if they have headquarters in the United States, how can they be focused on this work within this one geographic area? We have seen through the example of many, and B-Lab is one example where a subsidiary has piloted or taken on a set of standards and then worked to influence over many years, potentially a larger multinational company. And so we see a lot of opportunity in getting started in the United States and having that work impact the globe. And we do intend that we say very specifically, we're focused on the US to start, not that these are only United States standards. This is just where we're starting. And so the intention is to develop standards with more industry and regional specificity as we continue.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for the participant who asked that question, I hopefully captured many of the elements of what you were asking. So hopefully Jocelyn I articulated the question clearly and captured again the ethos of what you were asking. Jocelyn, I wanted to ask you, you spoke specifically about the defining of standards as a very clear alternative just to disclosure, right?
Performance standards. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Here's what we're doing, but I'm curious, when it comes to, could we imagine a world in 3 to 5 years where there's a very metric driven report or how might the performance goals be sort of reported out to, as part of a company's disclosure as far as what they're doing? So I'm just sort of curious how you might imagine that looking.
Yeah. And thank you for circling back to that. So I want to say that, disclosure is, and hopefully that was clear in the slide, disclosure is an important part of this work. And reaching specific goals, not just saying, tell us where you're at, but tell us where you're at in relationship to this goal, because this is what equity looks like, is the reason that we're creating corporate performance standards. That's the meaning behind that term. But your question was, what might the disclosure component look like? And I think there are many different designs. And I think 3 to 5 years is a really actually thoughtful, I'm sure you just kind of threw that out, but it's a thoughtful measure, because we do imagine that it will take time for companies to start to meet these goals, and potentially take time for companies to gather the data, to do the stakeholder engagement work where they feel comfortable starting to disclose this information. I think this can take a number of different forms. It may be in companies' impact reports that they start to share more. And we've seen that in the last number of years, right? In impact reports, folks are sharing more about their goals around diversity, equity, inclusion, sharing more around the diversity of their workforce. I'm specifically thinking, we've seen this in the tech sector specifically. And we want to continue to make that a norm and push what folks are sharing. Because there's a lot of detail that's important for us to know. So it could be in impact reports. We hope that one day, and hopefully not in the far too distant future, it's in folks' disclosures, their corporate disclosures as well, their filings. And we will be working with public officials and with policy to kind of move towards greater disclosure, so that we have more data and understanding through mandated reporting and filings as well. So it could take any number of those forms, but I think probably in the beginning, it will start with voluntary disclosure, and those actors who are out in front, like the Ben and Jerry's, saying, we think it's important to report, and others should as well.
Wonderful. Before we wrap up here in the next few minutes, we always like to offer our audience a couple very tactical takeaways. So what might be 2 to 3 things that you want our audience to know, to consider doing or even thinking about after today's conversation?
I'll offer, so hopefully there are some mindset nuggets in here for you to take away, and I'll just make them really explicit. Our work is guided by outcomes, right? It's not guided by the action. It's guided by what is the outcome we want to see and who we want that work to be done for. So we're very clear that the work is for that 100 million people. And therefore, people of color and low-income people are deeply integrated in our work and how we do our work. We are following our own method of engaging stakeholders deeply and continuously. And so in your work, as you're thinking about your DEI work, your racial equity work in your company, for whom? To what end, right? What are the equity outcomes you're thinking about? Who is the population you're considering? Is a really important point of guidance, so that you are really thoughtfully engaging the right people and continuing to track towards, are we doing this to benefit these people ultimately? Versus, are we doing this maybe for marketing, et cetera? So that would be one takeaway. And then the other takeaway is jump in. Jump in. Whether that is signing up for a training, get yourself reinvigorated and re-inspired, connecting with a community of people who are learning deeply about racial equity, or it's engaging directly with us by engaging in conversation about how these standards, how you can imagine implementing them, what you have already done, what you've learned along the way. So those would be my 2 takeaways. I think you came back just in time, Michael. We lost you for a second, but I just finished my response. So back over to you.
Amazing, Jocelyn. And I do apologize, but I said I was on a stable internet connection.
I know, you never know.
Otherwise, I cursed it. But just a final few announcements for our attendees. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Jocelyn, we so appreciate you being here with us today. It's been wonderfully insightful, informative, and actionable. And again, all our attendees, thank you for being here. If you could just take 30 seconds to fill out a very, very short survey. I believe it is only one question. I'm going to put it into the chat. And there it is. If you could just complete that, it does help us with future programming. If you're new to Conscious Capitalism, please visit consciouscapitalism.org for more information about our movement. And if you're an executive currently implementing conscious practices into your business, we invite you to explore our growing support system of like-minded leaders in our Conscious Capitalism Senior Leader Network. You can find out more about that on our website as well. We do have some more virtual gatherings coming up in the month of March and April, and you, again, can be found on our website. I will add a link to the chat there. And again, Jocelyn, a final thank you for spending your time with us this morning to share the work that you're doing at Policy.
Thank you all.
And I see Jocelyn has also kindly put in her email as well, if you want to do some pressure testing of her standards. So
yeah. Awesome.
thank you.
Thank you.